As this is the first Sunday of the month, we're posting the news and analysis episode for July. We have a true omnibus, a number of stories that affect the studios and the parks, with a greater focus on the Florida resort this time than the one in California. If I had to pin down themes for this month's episode, I'd say they are these. Entertainment returns to the parks, but also in surprising ways. And at the movies and on Disney Plus, we're experiencing the post-pandemic shift. The way we engage entertainment after the pandemic continues to change, to both Disney's delight and frustration, depending on which division is confronting those financials. That is, we're starting to see how the pandemic changed us as a people, and some of those changes will cause struggles inside of the Walt Disney Company. One last thing, I'm recording this week's episode from a hotel room, so there's going to be a little bit of background noise that I simply can't control, but I'm going to try to record around it. So if you're ready, here we go. To set up our discussion in later sections today, we first need to talk about Disney Plus and its effect on other divisions of the company. And this has to do with customer shift and the future of the cinema experience. On its second quarter earnings call earlier this year, Disney discussed its subscription numbers for Disney Plus. Disney Plus has been a central division of the company that expanded far more quickly than expected during COVID. But like Netflix and other subscription services, it has slowed down in recent months. On the call this past May, CEO Bob Chapek announced that Disney Plus during the previous quarter had picked up another 7.9 million subscribers, which puts them on track to meet their revised goal of a total of 230 to 260 million subscribers by 2024, and by hopefully becoming profitable by 2025. At the moment, Disney Plus is running at a deep loss, with the company subsidizing production on films and series to grow its subscriber base, with the belief that at a certain point in the future, the number of their subscribers, let's say 250 million, will not only pay for content but produce a profit. Chapek also discussed how half of their current subscribers were adults without kids, meaning that the service was not viewed exclusively as family or children's entertainment. And, at least on the surface, the 7.9 million new subscribers appeared to be meaningful growth. Shortly after the earnings report was posted, the Disney stock climbed over 3% in after-hours trading. But then investors began to dig down into those numbers. Most of the new subscriptions were in foreign territories where Disney Plus sells for a fraction of its cost in North America. In the United States, Disney Plus by itself cost $7.99 a month. In India, where many of these new subs come from, viewers can purchase Disney Plus plus Hotstar, which, like a cable service, includes TV shows, sports, and movies. So in India, viewers can purchase a service that is similar to a cable service plus Disney Plus for about 95 cents a month. Subscription services need to be financially scalable to the income levels in each country. Investors quickly figured out that though Disney Plus was picking up a large number of new subscribers, these subscribers weren't bringing in significant revenue to cover the cost of shows like Obi-Wan. I don't know exactly how much Obi-Wan cost to produce. It's been estimated that each episode of The Mandalorian had a budget of around $15 million. I would expect that it's slightly higher to produce Obi-Wan considering its cast. So maybe $20 million per episode or $120 million overall. That's the underlying concern. Even millions of new subscribers, if they are from lower-cost regions, won't be able to offset the tremendous cost of tentpole productions on Disney Plus, even by 2025. And in all of this, there's another issue that's swirling around. Disney Plus doesn't simply bring in money, it also subtracts potential income from other divisions. There are a group of Disney fans who will simply skip a movie in the theaters now, knowing that it will show up soon on the streaming service. This has been recently termed the Disney Plus effect, and we've talked about this in previous updates, that the pandemic changed how viewers will engage movies or movie-like stories in the coming years. In short, the pandemic was the event that finally undid longtime habits of the 20th century, specifically seeing movies on the big screen, and forced studios and theater chains to accept the realities of the 21st century, that the cinema experience would be a smaller part of people's lives moving forward. At this point, right now, at least in my view, we're starting to see some of these behaviors take root. Pixar's first theatrical release in over 2 years, Lightyear, came out on June 17th, with expectations that the film would take in between $70 and $85 million at the domestic box office. Instead, it took in just over $50 million, underperforming by about 30%. Lightyear is a reasonably well-reviewed movie. It's related to a franchise property, though it doesn't include the same versions of the characters in the better-known Toy Story offerings. Disney and others in the industry have referred to this at times as a spin-off. And admittedly, the concept, though appealing to adults, may be a little bit difficult to explain to young kids. Consider this conversation. This is not the Buzz Lightyear you remember from Toy Story, but the movie that Andy saw that made him want to buy the Buzz Lightyear toy based on this other version of Buzz Lightyear. For kids 7 years old and younger, I can see that as being a very loose concept to underpin this film. Regardless, the film had elements that 3 years ago, before the pandemic, should have directed it toward a high opening. But there are many things which have changed between 2019 and 2022, including the comfort levels of some individuals for spending time inside of a theater. But one of the key elements is how some viewers now choose to watch movies. This is essentially the Disney Plus effect. For the past 2 years, Disney demonstrated to their core audience that they could watch Pixar films at home without the hassle and expense of going to the theaters. Soul, Turning Red, and Luca all showed up as streaming premieres on Disney Plus. Even Onward showed up on Disney Plus pretty quickly after the start of the pandemic in 2019. Now, all families need to do to watch the newest Pixar movie at home is wait a few weeks to have it appear in their living room. How long will they need to wait? Well, Doctor Strange, which did far better at the box office than Lightyear, and therefore should have earned a longer theatrical run, showed up on Disney Plus 47 days after it was released to theaters. So if parents can just wait 6 or maybe 7 weeks, they can watch Lightyear at home. This is generally how they've been conditioned by this new service. And these expectations and options have underpinned a shift in how and when individuals choose to engage films at theaters. The top 5 movies for 2022 are highly visual, action-oriented franchise films, which is exactly what we thought would be the centerpiece of high-profit cinema offerings moving forward after the pandemic. The films that are drawing large audiences back to the cinema offer action set pieces that capitalize on the visual presentation space of a big screen. I should point out that Disney is included in these top 5 earners, but those offerings slant more toward the type of films that are arranged through Marvel or perhaps Star Wars than through Pixar and Disney Animation. The top 5 earners for the year so far are Top Gun, Doctor Strange, The Batman, Jurassic World Dominion, and Spider-Man No Way Home. Despite some investor disappointment in the most recent areas of growth at Disney Plus has a reasonable chance of capturing 250 million households subscribing to its service by the end of 2024. Assuming that an average household contains 3 people, that would mean that 1 in 10 people in the world would then have access to Disney Plus. That is a stunning accomplishment. But this growth comes at a cost. Some of these increases in income for Disney Plus will facilitate a decrease in revenue for other divisions, particularly box office revenue for Walt Disney Animation and Pixar. But this, as you know, is one of our ongoing stories, a trend that we've tracked very closely for the past 2 years. In terms of media consumption during the pandemic and post-pandemic years, this is the big shift. Consumer preferences have changed. Technology now exists to facilitate that change, and in the long run, if studios such as Disney are able to sell directly to consumers, they theoretically have the potential to make more money, largely by cutting out the portion of profit previously taken by theaters. I still think that the overall outcome in this area is pretty straightforward. Cinemas will need fewer screens and will focus more on visual spectaculars, while families will spend more time at home enjoying film-style entertainment on TVs. Not only because it's more convenient, but because projects on streaming services allow for longer running times with more deeply developed characters and more complex plots. In 2022, as a limited series, Moon Knight ran for 5 hours. If this project had been developed as a 2019 film, it might have run for half that, at around 2.5 hours. So this shift is both an increase in home-delivered cinema-style entertainment that allows for longer and more immersive stories, and a refocusing of big-budget cinema around visually compelling franchise films that slant toward action or adventure. There, of course, will be outlier films or a project here and there that doesn't fall into this model, but if you've been around for a while and can remember the multiplex culture of the 1980s or the 1990s, I'm pretty sure that this world is not going to come back. It's going to fade into something else. But its diminished importance is going to allow something more interesting to take its place. The shift from the old model to the new one is going to be a struggle in which some divisions at the Disney company are winners and others are not, in which things that perhaps we used to love about the pre-pandemic world will change to allow new experiences to exist. But to look at this from a slightly different angle, a video streaming service is a monster to support with new content each week, and that leads us to our next story. On Tuesday, June 21st, Disney live-streamed a version of Harmonious in which the usual soundtrack for the performance was replaced by a live symphony and live singers. Disney is a company that uses synergy. Basically, most everything inside the company is a path, or in the terms of cultural studies, an ad leading to another experience or product. The Marvel movies are a path that lead to Disney Plus, which then leads to merchandise such as a shirt related to the Marvel films, which then leads to others seeing you wear that shirt and being reminded about Marvel, and so on. This is corporate synergy, and executives are beginning to experiment as to how Disney Plus might be able to more fully participate in these types of activities. Harmonious Live is an excellent example of this type of synergy. The Parks division produces Harmonious, which in this case is being used to create content for Disney Plus, which will satisfy subscribers. There are millions of Disney Plus subscribers in Seattle, Hawaii, and Paris who will likely never visit Epcot. And for them, this show exists as streaming entertainment only. But there is another group of Disney Plus subscribers who will see this performance on TV and then make a trip to Disney World. By itself, of course, Harmonious Live likely won't produce a high number of new vacation packages sold by Disney, but combined with other programming elements over the year, such as multiple programs Disney airs over the winter holidays, these efforts become an ongoing reminder to book a Disney vacation. This, then, is a benefit to the Disney parks. But beneath all this, I'm pretty sure there's something else at play here. Disney World presently has a capacity problem, particularly at night. Epcot has the largest footprint in terms of usable public space and therefore the largest capacity. It can simply hold more guests. But Harmonious, with some tepid reviews, hasn't drawn significant crowds. If you walk through the Magic Kingdom on a typical night, it's packed. If you walk through Epcot on a typical night, it is far less packed. There is one, and really only one, perfectly ideal viewing location for Harmonious, which we've talked about in previous episodes, and this fills up an hour or so before the performance. But outside of that, you can walk up to the rail of World Showcase Lagoon and find a spot 5 minutes before the show starts. Disney simply needs to shift people from the other parks over to Epcot to even out capacity. From one perspective, the park reservation system is a method to ensure that the parks aren't overcrowded. But from another perspective, the reservation system is also a tool that allows Disney to more evenly distribute interested guests between their 4 parks. Typically, the Magic Kingdom and Hollywood Studios are the first to fill reservations. The third is Animal Kingdom. This leaves Epcot as a park that can absorb crowds without feeling crowded. But to move guests over to Epcot and to have them feel satisfied, Disney needs to entice them in that direction. Harmonious Live moves guests in that direction. And now here's where comes in all of the unusual stuff. I was in the park for the Harmonious Live performance, and let me start with this. It was entirely directed at the streaming audience. You could have watched Harmonious that night and had no idea that the musical narrative elements were different than the usual performance. The stage was arranged at the entrance to World Showcase Lagoon between those 2 box-shaped stores, Port of Call and Disney Traders. Only there was no way for people inside the park to see that stage from any angle. Around the stage were those tall evergreen hedges, the ones that are usually placed into movable planter boxes. These are plants that Disney typically uses to elegantly screen off an area. And in front of those evergreen barriers were a row of cast members who politely reminded you to keep moving. The evergreen screen surrounded the entire stage on the back and sides. Sure, there were telltale signs of video production that night, such as the elevated light banks arranged near the stage, and perhaps most obviously, the long reach crane placed at the front of the tram turnaround area. And side note, for those of you who are interested, the trams still haven't returned to Epcot. This crane was situated on 4 platform bases, balanced, and then it extended its boom up to hold a camera, an aerial position that was further stabilized by multiple guy wires. I'm not exactly sure how tall the crane was, but it was clear that it was taller than Spaceship Earth, which is 180 feet. On the video stream, this was the camera that took in both the aerials of both the Spaceship Earth countdown and some of the finale fireworks. Shortly after 8 p.m., a small live audience was loaded into the stage area. You might have seen these people in the live stream. Typically for televised parades, the live audience directly before the cameras is comprised of cast members, most of those from the college program who are given ears and other wearable swag to finish off the Disney-centered image. I assume the same proved true for this event. Around 8:40, the talent was walked from the backstage area near the Canada Pavilion into the stage area. They, too, were ringed by cast members. And, well, they were pretty easy to pick out. Anyone in a long blue performance gown sort of stands out in a crowd dressed almost entirely in t-shirts, shorts, and sweat. And then they put the performers in place for the show. Outside of the stage area, everything went off as it did on any other night with one exception. The show started at 9:10 instead of 9 o'clock, even though attractions in the park still closed at 9. I'm guessing, based on some of the lagoon torches turning off and then on, that those elements were on a manual mode that night. And then at 9:10, the show started. There was no announcement of a live performance. There was no way to see clearly into the stage area, even from the far side of the lagoon over by Japan. The performance went forward as any other night. No doubt there was an extensive click track and sync track to keep everyone in perfect time with the pre-programmed elements of Harmonious. There were some minor differences in terms of the performance, in the narration, but that was about it. Also, I would like to say that there were minor differences in the pyro specifically for the performance, but I'm not 100% sure that's true. The pyro for Harmonious over the past 9 months has changed multiple times due to supply chain issues, with the shells being shipped from China. The pyro can also be toned down due to environmental elements, but I'm fairly sure that the pyro was changed for the show, typically with the pyro displays at the end of the numbers, and here I'm guessing so the sound of the pyro wasn't picked up by some live mics and didn't distract performers, perhaps to the point where they couldn't focus on the click track. In this, aside from the musical live feed, which I'm guessing over half of the park guests didn't know was different than the regular soundtrack, this show had no elements specifically to entertain guests in the park. It was an entirely camera-facing performance. This was truly a test to gauge how effective content like this streaming from the park might be in satisfying the Disney Plus audience, and also how events like this might inspire guests to visit Epcot, particularly at night, rather than one of the other parks. But here's the other odd thing. The Harmonious show, the one that guests will see if they visit Epcot, was only a minor part of the live stream. The focus was heavily arranged on the live performance, typically presenting only the lagoon show when it swelled with overhead fireworks, which, as I mentioned, was somewhat rare during this live Disney Plus stream. As I mentioned at the start, one of the themes of this update is live entertainment returning to the parks, and we'll continue down this path in our next 2 stories. Over in Animal Kingdom, a revamped and shortened version of Finding Nemo the Musical has reappeared at the Theater in the Wild stage with a slightly different name, Finding Nemo the Big Blue and Beyond. As we've discussed in previous updates, live entertainment, or the lack of it, was one of the major barriers in terms of increasing park capacity. With limited live entertainment, guest attention was almost wholly on rides and attractions, which stretched out standby lines, placed tremendous pressure on those attractions, and often created unsatisfied guests. The Theater in the Wild holds about 1,500 guests. On a typical day presently, I'd estimate that Animal Kingdom has about 20,000, maybe 25,000 guests in it. The show, at least right now, is not completely filling seats in the theater. This is in part a function of the lower capacity at the park. With lower guest capacity in the overall park, individual shows will capture a lower number of guests. Though the theater isn't filling every seat, it's not empty either. The times that I've been there recently, I'd say that there is around 1,000 guests in the theater, or that the theater is around 70% full, with lots of space around each family group. The show itself is shorter and therefore a little more family-friendly, especially for families with younger kids. The previous version ran around 45 minutes and was more focused on the narrative. The current version is more of a jukebox musical, in which key moments of the film are expressed in song. The cast is slightly smaller than the previous incarnation as well. It is, though, a great half-hour respite from the heat, especially if you have small kids with you. I do remember the Theater of the Wild having more powerful air conditioning, but even if they've dialed up the thermostat a little, which I think they have, it's still a relaxing and cool place to hide out for a half hour. Overall, I like this show, as it is the direct descendant of The Lion King on Broadway. which was the second stage musical produced by Disney Theatrical Productions. Their first effort, Beauty and the Beast, was a fairly safe production with characters arranged much as they might be in a theme park, with makeup and costumes and effects designed in part by Imagineering. In reviews, Disney was criticized for these decisions. When Lion King opened on Broadway in 1997, Disney Theatrical Productions opted for a riskier and more experimental presentation, arranged through the vision of its director, Julie Taymor. Taymor, who had spent time in Indonesia and Japan, opted for the type of puppets familiar in Japanese and Indonesian theaters as the basis for her production. Unlike a typical theme park show, these puppets did not conceal the performers in adapting The Lion King for Broadway. For the most part, one performer managed one puppet while singing or speaking a part. The audience could see both the puppet presenting the song as well as the performer actually singing the song. Some puppets, such as the elephants, were operated by multiple actors, but for the most part, the show offered a one-to-one equivalency, with the audience invited to focus on a puppet representing, for example, Timon, and also on the actor managing the puppet and speaking his lines. Reviews overall suggested that this was a successful and unique way to adapt an animated film into a Broadway production. Finding Nemo is the descendant of this experimental production. The Finding Nemo stage, in terms of characters, is nowhere near as full as the Broadway stage. The Lion King had over 200 puppets. But Finding Nemo, both the original and the updated musical, breaks some fundamental theme park rules in interesting ways. On its surface, the show is artistic, deeply musical, and engaging. But the show also invites the audience to see the artistry behind the illusion. The audience can easily see both the puppets and the performers manipulating their mouth and eye movements while speaking. This is the exact opposite character strategy as to that which is arranged elsewhere at the parks, where the performer is hidden inside of a costume and guests are asked to believe only in the reality of the character and not consider the performer behind the appearance. At this level, Finding Nemo with its oversized mechanical puppets is not only about the performance, but also about how the show is constructed and performed. The technology and performance style originated by Disney Theatrical now benefits the parks. And on a practical note, if you want to visit the show with your kids, I suggest you rewatch Finding Nemo before coming to the park. The show at the park presents narrative highlights of Finding Nemo in song. For those of you who haven't seen Finding Nemo in a while, it's not a musical. And that will help your kids to follow along. But for the rest of you, the thing to notice is this. Finding Nemo is a presentation that undermines the general character strategy of the Disney experience. For decades, Disney developed strategies so, for the most part, the performers behind Mickey Mouse, Goofy, and other characters were hidden, and your attention was directed only to the character's identity. In this show, your gaze is invited to take in both the character construction, which are elaborate puppets, and also the tools used to create that character, which is the performer, and the handheld controls that manages character movement. This show, after a 2-year closure, reopened in June and has daily performances, though the park seems to be experimenting with the number of performances it needs each day, as the park is still operating with a reduced capacity. Our last story on this episode is about the reopening and history of the Hoop-Dee-Doo Musical Revue out at Fort Wilderness in Disney World. Just as Finding Nemo the musical is an artistic descendant of Lion King on Broadway, Hoop-Dee-Doo is an artistic descendant of the Golden Horseshoe Revue, Walt's favorite show at Disneyland, which in Florida was performed as the Diamond Horseshoe Revue. Pioneer Hall opened way back on October 1st, 1974, during the middle of the oil crisis, when Disney World saw Americans stay home during the summer season, which meant that the resort had a smaller budget to fund new projects. Though there had been plans to feature entertainment in Fort Wilderness for a while. When Pioneer Hall first opened, it had no stage show. It was simply a place to eat, which was somewhat oddly next to a stage. The stage itself had a piano and a mic, which was soon used by musicians already employed at the resort. Among those musicians who played there was Randy Morris, a pianist from Main Street, along with Disney's banjo duo, Pat Terry Sr. and Pat Terry Jr., each of them dressed in teal jackets, white pants, and a red bow tie. This was the first attempt to fill the stage at Pioneer Hall, but it was only a temporary plan. During this same period, both before and after the hall opened, Bev Bergeron, one of the early performers to play Pecos Bill at the Diamond Horseshoe, was asked to create a new show in the style of the Diamond Horseshoe Revue for the Pioneer Hall stage, an effort that never got very far, at least in that first version. But then, as Disney explored other options, that effort to develop something similar to, perhaps longer than the Diamond Horseshoe Revue, began to expand. Bergeron was able to include other members from the Diamond Horseshoe Revue, including Sue Hatfield, who also played Slewfoot Sue in that revue, to create a show that had elements of melodrama, comedy, and music. Tom Adair, who had written songs for Disney films and TV shows, along with material for the Golden Horseshoe Revue, was brought in to develop music. Most significantly, Larry Billman was added to work on the script. Though only 35 years old, Billman had appeared on screen and on stage, had worked as a choreographer, and for the past 5 years, had helped expand live entertainment at Disneyland and then at Disney World. He had developed a specialty in creating musical revues that featured singers and dancers, but not the costumed characters that appeared seasonally at the parks. Typically, his shows carried a theme, such as The Wonders of America or Song Hits of the Summer, around which he would build a production. The Pioneer Hall show would be similar, though slightly more narrative, as the underlying conceit presented a group of traveling musicians who, during the late 1800s, performed from town to town. Even though the show was beginning to take shape, there was still the issue of staffing and paying for those performers to fill the stage during a year when Disney had a limited development budget. It was the entertainment division who devised a plan to move forward with the production for the summer season during that economically lean year. For years in both Florida and California, Disney had hired college musicians to fill its parks with music, primarily performance majors who sent in audition tapes for spots in marching bands and vocal groups. Both Disneyland and the Magic Kingdom had their own all-American college marching band and Kids of the Kingdom groups. The Magic Kingdom also had the Bohemian Police Band. In 1974, Disney World believed they could arrange a stage show in Fort Wilderness by advertising for a fourth group of college students for a group called the Pioneer Hall Players. For the marching bands and singing groups, the spots were almost entirely filled with students interested in a career in music. But for the Pioneer Hall Players, as it was its first year, and as it was somewhat hastily put together, the entertainment division was open to people who were studying drama and to those who simply had an interest in performance. But this plan, too, would take months to enact. Students needed to send in applications, the school year needed to end, and selected applicants needed to travel to Florida, typically in June. And even once they were there, they would need to rehearse and develop the production that would be presented in Pioneer Hall, a production that grew out of notes and ideas assembled but never finished by the stars of the Diamond Horseshoe Revue. In the meantime, Disney still had an empty stage, except when musicians from other areas of the resort played there. As a stopgap measure, Disney hired a group of 7 musicians from Woodstock, New York, who called themselves the 4-Star Spangled Washboard Band. If Kids of the Kingdom presented the idealized Disney look of the 1970s with young performers in pleated skirts and pressed slacks, the Washboard Band presented the far other end of the spectrum. The band had 4 main musicians and 3 replacements, so it could be featured every night. They looked like hippies, yet performed like hillbillies. In an article announcing their arrival, they were described as follows, quote, "The leader, Polecat, a guitarist, had 3 star-spangled hairy partners. Don Down-Home Dworkin on washboard and jugs, Paul Spider Josman on banjo, and Greg Wild Bill Hames on washboard and just about every other kind of percussion oddity which can manage a sound. Spoons, bells, sticks. Polecat has short hair but a long fuzzy beard. Both Spider and Down-Home have longish Brillo-pad hair, and Wild Bill has a ponytail." In an interview, the leader, Polecat, explained, quote, "We hit the bluegrass festivals last summer. They've become really big because of Deliverance, I guess. At one festival, after the people had been saturated with pure bluegrass, I think some of the freaks wanted Grateful Dead, we came on. We're not strictly bluegrass, but we became stars on the circuit after that. People have traveled 200 to 300 miles to see us." The band's goals at the time, as they listed them, included cutting an album, creating a libretto for a washboard musical that would also include their music, and appearing on TV, specifically the country western comedy show Hee Haw. In spring and early summer of 1974, they appeared twice a night at Pioneer Hall at 7 and 9:30 p.m. Their act, focused on music and comedy, was a step beyond the straight musical performance that initiated the hall, but most importantly, the Washboard Band gave Disney 3 months to advertise for and select the Pioneer Hall players, bring them to Florida in June, and set up a workshop to develop a musical review. It would take weeks to develop the show, then the college students would perform it until Labor Day, when the college program ended. The show was imagined as a summer-only offering, lasting less than 2 months. The students who accepted offers were mostly performing arts majors, though some were simply interested in performing. The first person to play Dolly, Marilyn Magnus, was majoring in British literature at the University of Redlands in California, but she had performed previously part-time at Knott's Berry Farm. The performers were housed in apartments, asked to join various professional unions, and given college credit for their work over the summer, with grades arranged as either pass or fail. Their instructors, who arranged craft talks with professional performers and other class-like activities, were Art Barner for the 2 performance bands, Bob Burrows for Kids of the Kingdom, and future theme park designer Gary Goddard for the Pioneer Hall players. Goddard himself was just out of Cal Arts and more or less the same age as all of the students in what was then called the Disney World College Music Workshop Project. Goddard would function as the assistant director under Larry Billman, who was the one actual adult in the group. In Billman's memory, the script was mostly done by the time the college kids arrived, but would have space for them to personalize their roles and also to improvise. But others remembered that they needed to develop significant areas of the production. Ronald Davis, a musician working on the show, remembered that, quote, "There were long stretches of time where I was not needed during rehearsals. I spent much of that time at the table where Larry Billman was sitting. Much of the rehearsal process was watching the cast go through the script and endlessly brainstorming ideas." At the end of the month, on June 30th, they opened as a dinner theater. They performed segments of the show between meal courses. The first performance was mildly attended, but from there word of mouth spread and people began to come. The food that summer was similar to offerings that would continue with the show for years. Fried chicken, barbecued ribs, corn on the cob, beans followed by strawberry shortcake. By the end of the summer, the show had a small following. Quote, "It was such an overwhelming success," Billman said, that someone in the company said, "Maybe we ought to extend that." A plan was arranged so that as the college performers went home, Gary Goddard would take over Billman's role as director and recreate the show with a professional cast, actually overlapping casts, so that the show could continue year-round, night after night. The show with its pro cast opened in September 1974. It played continuously for over 45 years, 7 nights a week, 3 shows a day, until, like many things at the resort, it closed in March 2020 due to the pandemic. This past week, it finally reopened after an 800-day closure, and I was lucky enough to see it on its first night. There are a few changes to the show. The background images have been replaced. In some cases, it seems that this was related to cultural sensitivity issues, specifically to images of Native Americans, but in other cases, it seems that some of the art simply needs to be refreshed. Likewise, the lighting package has been updated to give the stage a more contemporary feel, even though the show is set in the 1800s. In a similar vein, some of the dialogue and lyrics, some of which was written decades ago, has been updated to remove elements that are now viewed as inappropriate or insensitive. Lastly, rifles have been removed from the show as well. But for the vast majority of the show, it remains the same as it was 3 years ago, or 13 years ago, or 30 years ago. Some elements have also been improved. I've seen this show many times, dating back to when I was a kid over 4 decades ago. And this is one of the show's appeals. It is one of the few stage productions that can be handed down from generation to generation. But on opening night this past week, the performers were some of the most musical and deeply talented I've ever seen on the Pioneer Hall stage. They shifted from gruff speaking tones of pioneers into pitch-perfect 3-part harmony and then back again. Hoop has always had the feel of community theater, which is its underlying conceit. But now it has far more the appearance of deeply talented professionals who playfully take on the appearance of community theater. As for the food, the chicken is better than the ribs, in part I assume because chicken is easier to prepare for 200 people who need to be served at the same time than is beef. The salad, cornbread, and strawberry shortcake in particular are excellent. The side dishes of mashed potatoes, baked beans, and definitely the mac and cheese aren't to the level of the chicken and shortcake, but that's not why people visit Pioneer Hall. Hoop is both the literary and spiritual descendant of the Golden and Diamond Horseshoe Revues, which was Walt's favorite show at the park. The show is a throwback to an earlier time, the type of family-centered entertainment that defined the 1950s. That's the reason to visit Pioneer Hall. Outside of YouTube, you can't see the Golden Horseshoe Revue anymore, but this is a show, similar in tone, that grew out of the earlier show's success. Hoop-de-doo is a way to sample the type of entertainment that was part of Walt's original vision for his park, the type of show that in the States only exists here. As the show has recently reopened, reservations are difficult to get. The stage is dark on Mondays and Tuesdays. Though it's clear the hall has the performers for rotating productions, even on opening night, the cast for the 4 p.m. show was slightly different than the cast for the 6:15 show, with different performers each given some time on stage during opening night. I'm guessing that the real limiter here is the kitchen staff, which has been an issue for restaurants across the property. But hopefully, in the not-too-distant future, the show will be able to expand out to 7 days a week. The reopening of Hoop might also mean that other services return to the resort. For the past 2 years, the campground and the Bay Lake dock next to Pioneer Hall has only had boat service to the Magic Kingdom. The launch service between the campground and the Contemporary never came back online after the pandemic. In previous episodes, we've talked about the resort's underlying economic structure, essentially how it contains a number of individual companies, all owned by Disney, but with their own budgets. For this boat service to come back online, the Contemporary would need to help pay to staff it. That essentially has been the sticking point. Now that Hoop is back on the Pioneer Hall stage, guests at the Contemporary will want boats that take them over to Pioneer Hall. So this might be the thing that finally moves another element of the larger Disney service back into operation. In my own life for the past year or so, this has been one of the joys that I've looked forward to. Watching the parks reopen, restaurants fire up their kitchens, various tours come back online, and performers, after 800 days, take to the stage again, picking up roles that have been set aside for over 2 years. On those reopening days, at parks or on tours or here at Pioneer Hall, cast members, chefs, and performers radiate excitement as they help to rebuild the world that we all used to know. There's no doubt that there's a lot of troubling news in the world right now, also a lot of trouble in the world of parks and film. But on this month's update, at least in our last 2 segments, we've focused on a couple of things that are making the world slightly better right now. Hopefully, these are stories that you can hold on to as you move through the week ahead. Next week, we'll start our longer series for the summer season. Last winter and spring, we looked at the Sherman Brothers, and last fall and winter, we looked at the opening of Walt Disney World. And I think you'll be surprised and interested at the topic this time as we jump down into it. Also, like some of our other longer series, the main story will play out in its entirety on iTunes and everywhere else this podcast is heard, but there will be at least one side story posted with this series that explores a related topic when we get to it. As you know, we're an ad-free, listener-supported podcast. Without subscribers, we'd simply cease to exist. We do just 2 things: deep dives on stories related to the history of the Disney studio and parks, and news and analysis of current events as they relate to the Walt Disney Company. If you enjoy these episodes, please support our efforts by becoming a monthly Bandcamp subscriber. On Bandcamp, you'll find dozens and dozens of extra episodes, but the best reason to subscribe is to make sure that this podcast continues to exist. You can subscribe at dhipodcast.bandcamp.com. I'll also leave a link down in the show notes. Okay, so here's hoping the week is good to you, and until next Sunday, this is Todd James Pierce.